Jake Morrison was just 17 when he set off from Campsite 12 in Glacier's Whispering Pines, planning nothing more than a short morning hike. His brother Daniel and their father Robert expected him back in time for lunch. But Jake never returned. For weeks, search teams scoured the mountains with helicopters, dogs, and hundreds of volunteers, yet not a single trace of him was found. To his family, it was as if the forest had simply swallowed him whole. And then, 11 years later, a geology student digging soil samples near Deadfall Ridge struck something metallic. Brushing away the dirt, he uncovered a silver watch, still ticking after more than a decade underground. What made it chilling was the skeletal hand still strapped to it, frozen in place, as if Jake had been desperately checking the time in his final moments. Detective Marcus Rivera stared at the evidence bag containing the silver watch, its second hand still moving in steady rhythm despite 11 years buried in the mountain dirt. The timepiece belonged to Jake Morrison, a 17-year-old hiker who had vanished without a trace during a camping trip to Whispering Pines National Forest. What made this discovery even more chilling was the skeletal hand still wrapped around the watch band, as if Jake had been desperately trying to check the time in his final moments. Marcus had seen plenty of strange cases in his 20-year career, but nothing quite like this. The watch had been discovered by a geology student named Tommy Chun, who was collecting soil samples for his thesis research. Tommy had been digging near Deadfall Ridge when his shovel struck something metallic. At first, he thought it was just an old piece of camping equipment, but when he brushed away the dirt, he saw the gleaming watch face and the unmistakable outline of human bones. Tommy immediately called the park rangers, who contacted the police department in the nearby town of Cedar Falls. Marcus examined the case file that had grown thick with false leads and dead ends over the years. Jake Morrison had been camping with his older brother Daniel and their father Robert when he disappeared. The family had been staying at Campsite 12, a popular spot near the base of Eagle Mountain. According to the original reports, Jake had gone for a solo hike on the morning of his disappearance and never returned. Search teams had combed the area for weeks, using helicopters, tracking dogs, and hundreds of volunteers, but they found no trace of the teenager. What bothered Marcus most was the location where the watch was found. Deadfall Ridge was more than 8 miles from the Morrison family campsite, through some of the most treacherous terrain in the forest. The ridge was known for its unstable rock formations and steep drop-offs. It seemed impossible that a 17-year-old boy would have ventured so far from camp, especially alone. Yet here was proof that Jake had somehow ended up in one of the most dangerous areas of the park. The detective studied the photographs from the excavation site. The hand bones were positioned as if Jake had been reaching for something or perhaps trying to signal for help. The watch showed a time of 3:47, though it was impossible to know if that was AM or PM or even which day it represented. Marcus made a note to have the forensics team examine the watch more closely. Modern timepieces often contained electronic components that could provide valuable data about when it stopped and started. Robert Morrison had passed away 5 years ago from a heart attack, taking whatever secrets he might have known to his grave. But Daniel Morrison, now 29 years old, still lived in Cedar Falls and worked as a mechanic at Henderson's auto shop. Marcus knew he would need to interview Daniel again, even though the man had been questioned extensively during the original investigation. Sometimes, with the passage of time and new evidence, people remember details they had previously overlooked or chosen to keep hidden. The detective also wanted to speak with Tommy Chun about the exact circumstances of his discovery. Geology students were trained to observe their surroundings carefully, and Tommy might have noticed something that the crime scene photographers had missed. Marcus had learned that the smallest details often held the key to solving complex cases, especially ones that had remained cold for over a decade. As Marcus prepared to leave the station, his partner Detective Luis Santos approached with a concerned expression. Luis had worked the Morrison case during its early stages and remembered the family well. He warned Marcus that reopening the investigation would bring back painful memories for everyone involved. The Morrison case had haunted Cedar Falls for years, creating suspicion and fear among residents who wondered if a killer was still walking among them. But Marcus felt certain that the discovery of Jake's watch was just the beginning. Something told him that the truth about what happened on Eagle Mountain 11 years ago was far more complicated than anyone had imagined. The fact that the watch was still ticking suggested that someone had been maintaining it, or that it had been buried much more recently than Jake's disappearance. Either possibility opened up disturbing new questions about what really happened to the Morrison family during their camping trip. Marcus locked the evidence bag in his desk drawer and headed home for the night, but sleep would not come easily. In his mind, he could see the skeletal hand clutching the watch, frozen in time like a desperate message from beyond the grave. Tomorrow, he would begin unraveling a mystery that had already claimed too many victims. This case is going to change everything we thought we knew about Jake Morrison's disappearance. Daniel Morrison's hands shook as he gripped his coffee cup, the hot liquid sloshing dangerously close to the rim. Marcus had called him the night before, asking to meet at the Bluebird Diner on Main Street to discuss new developments in his brother's case. Daniel had barely slept, his mind racing with possibilities and fears he had spent 11 years trying to suppress. The detective sitting across from him seemed different from the others who had investigated Jake's disappearance, more focused, more determined to find answers that might be better left buried. Marcus studied Daniel's reaction carefully as he explained about the watch discovery. The man's face went pale when he heard about the skeletal hand, and his eyes darted nervously toward the diner entrance, as if he were planning an escape route. Daniel had been 21 when Jake disappeared, old enough to have his own secrets and motivations. The original investigation had focused primarily on external threats, wild animals, accidents, or stranger abductions, but Marcus wondered if the real danger had come from within the Morrison family itself. "I need you to walk me through that last day again," Marcus said, pulling out his notebook. "Start from when you woke up and tell me everything you remember, no matter how small it might seem. Sometimes new evidence helps shake loose old memories." Daniel nodded reluctantly and began recounting the events, but his story sounded rehearsed, as if he had practiced it many times over the years. He described making breakfast with his father while Jake slept in, mentioned their plan to hike to Lookout Point together, and recalled Jake's decision to take a different trail at the last minute. But Marcus noticed inconsistencies in Daniel's account that hadn't appeared in his original statements. This time, Daniel mentioned that Jake had seemed upset about something the night before their final hike. He described his brother as being moody and secretive, behavior that was unusual for the normally cheerful teenager. When Marcus pressed for more details, Daniel became evasive, claiming he couldn't remember what had triggered Jake's strange mood. The detective made careful notes, sensing that Daniel was holding back crucial information. The conversation was interrupted when Tommy entered the diner, recognizing Marcus from their phone conversation the previous day. The geology student looked tired and stressed, his usual confidence replaced by obvious anxiety. Tommy approached their table hesitantly, glancing around the diner, as if he feared being overheard. Marcus invited him to sit down, thinking it might be beneficial for Daniel and Tommy to meet face to face. Sometimes hearing about a discovery directly from the person who made it could prompt new revelations. Tommy described finding the watch in detail, explaining how he had been collecting samples from a specific geological formation when his equipment struck the metal. He emphasized that the burial site appeared deliberately chosen, located in a small depression that would have been protected from erosion and wildlife. The way the hand bones were positioned suggested that Jake had been conscious when he was buried, possibly even trying to dig his way out. Tommy's scientific observations painted a horrifying picture of Jake's final moments, causing Daniel to excuse himself from the table abruptly. While Daniel was in the restroom, Tommy leaned closer to Marcus and lowered his voice. He revealed that he had found other items near the watch that he hadn't mentioned in his official report, fragments of torn fabric that appeared to be from a camping jacket, and what looked like scratch marks on nearby rocks. Tommy had photographed these additional pieces of evidence with his phone, but he was reluctant to turn them over to the police without understanding their significance. He feared that his discovery might somehow implicate innocent people or reopen old wounds that had finally begun to heal. When Daniel returned to the table, his composure had improved, but Marcus noticed that his hands were still trembling slightly. The detective decided to test Daniel's reaction by sharing some of Tommy's additional findings. He mentioned the fabric fragments and asked if Daniel could identify what type of jacket Jake had been wearing on their final hiking trip. Daniel's response was immediate and defensive. He claimed not to remember specific details about Jake's clothing, despite having vivid memories of other aspects of that day. Marcus sensed that both men were hiding important information, but for different reasons. Tommy seemed motivated by scientific caution and a desire to protect others from unnecessary pain. Daniel's motivations were less clear, but his nervousness suggested guilt or fear rather than simple grief. The detective knew he would need to interview each man separately to get to the truth. Group conversations often allowed people to coordinate their stories or take cues from each other's reactions. As the meeting concluded, Marcus gave both men his business card and asked them to call if they remembered anything else about Jake's disappearance or the watch discovery. He watched their body language carefully as they left the diner, noting that Daniel headed immediately to his truck while Tommy lingered on the sidewalk, seeming to struggle with some internal conflict. The geology student eventually approached Marcus again, asking for a private conversation later that evening. Marcus agreed to meet Tommy at his apartment after dark, sensing that the young man had more to reveal about his discovery. The detective's instincts told him that the Morrison case was about to break wide open, but he wasn't sure he was prepared for what the truth might reveal. As he drove back to the station, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that Jake Morrison's death was connected to family secrets that multiple people were still desperate to protect. Something tells me that watch is just the tip of the iceberg. Tommy Chin's apartment was cluttered with geological charts, rock samples, and scientific equipment that made Marcus feel like he was entering a laboratory rather than a living space. The young graduate student had spread several photographs across his kitchen table, each showing different angles of the excavation site where Jake's watch had been discovered. Under the harsh fluorescent lighting, the images revealed details that had been missed in the initial crime scene documentation. Tommy pointed to specific features in the photographs, his scientific training evident in the way he analyzed each piece of evidence methodically. "Look at this pattern in the soil," Tommy said, indicating disturbed earth that formed an almost perfect rectangle around where the hand had been buried. This wasn't a random burial or an accidental death. Someone dug a specific hole, placed Jake's body in a deliberate position, and then covered it with layers of different soil types. The geological stratification shows that this burial happened in stages, probably over several hours. Marcus studied the photographs with growing unease, realizing that Jake's death was looking more and more like a carefully planned murder rather than a hiking accident. Tommy had also discovered something else that he hadn't shared with anyone, a small metal object buried near Jake's hand that appeared to be a key. The key was tarnished with age, but still recognizable, with numbers etched into its surface that looked like they might correspond to a locker or storage unit. Tommy had cleaned the key carefully and photographed it from multiple angles, but he was reluctant to turn it over to the police without understanding its significance. He worried that rushing to conclusions might harm innocent people or derail the investigation. The geology student explained his theory about the timeline of Jake's burial based on soil compression and mineral deposits. According to his analysis, the body had been buried during a period of heavy rainfall, which would have occurred during the week after Jake's disappearance. This meant that Jake had been kept somewhere else for several days before being transported to Deadfall Ridge. The implications were chilling. Jake might have been held captive, possibly tortured or interrogated, before being killed and buried in the remote location. Marcus examined the key photographs closely, noting the numbers 247 etched into the metal surface. The key looked like it belonged to a storage facility or bus station locker, the kind used for temporary storage of personal belongings. He asked Tommy if there were any such facilities near Cedar Falls, and the student mentioned the Greyhound station on the outskirts of town, which had been there for decades. Marcus made a mental note to check if locker 247 still existed and what it might contain. Tommy's apartment was interrupted by a knock at the door, causing both men to freeze in alarm. Through the window, Marcus could see Daniel Morrison standing on the front porch, looking agitated and desperate. Tommy reluctantly opened the door, and Daniel entered without invitation, his eyes immediately focusing on the photographs spread across the table. His reaction was immediate and visceral. He lunged forward, trying to gather up the images, claiming they were too disturbing for public viewing and should be destroyed. Marcus intervened, restraining Daniel and demanding to know why he was so upset by the photographs. Daniel's explanation was rambling and emotional, claiming that seeing images of his brother's remains was traumatic and that the investigation should focus on finding Jake's killer rather than analyzing every detail of his death. But his behavior suggested something more than grief. There was fear in his eyes, and his hands shook as he pointed at specific photographs, as if he recognized something that others had missed. The confrontation escalated when Daniel noticed the key photographs among the evidence. His reaction was even more extreme, demanding to know where Tommy had found the key and whether he had tried to use it. When Tommy confirmed that he had discovered the key near Jake's hand, Daniel became increasingly agitated, pacing around the small apartment and muttering under his breath. Marcus realized that Daniel recognized the key and knew its significance, but the man was clearly terrified of revealing what he knew. Tommy tried to defuse the situation by explaining his scientific approach to the investigation, emphasizing that he was only interested in finding the truth about what happened to Jake. But Daniel seemed beyond reason, accusing both men of interfering with matters they didn't understand. He warned them that some secrets were better left buried, and that digging deeper into Jake's death would only cause more pain for everyone involved. His words carried an undertone of threat that made Marcus instinctively rest his hand on his service weapon. The situation reached a breaking point when Daniel suddenly grabbed the key photographs and tried to destroy them. Marcus tackled him to the floor, and during the struggle, Daniel shouted something that made both men freeze in shock. He screamed that the key would lead them to evidence that would destroy multiple families, not just his own. The implication was clear. Jake's death involved more people than just the Morrison family, and Daniel knew who they were. After restraining Daniel and calling for backup, Marcus began to piece together the broader implications of what he had learned. The key, the deliberate burial, and Daniel's extreme reaction all pointed to a conspiracy that had been hidden for 11 years. Jake Morrison hadn't simply vanished during a family camping trip. He had been murdered by people who knew him well, and his death was connected to secrets that multiple individuals were still desperate to protect. As patrol officers arrived to take Daniel into custody, Marcus realized that the Morrison case was about to expose a web of deception that reached far beyond one family's tragedy. Marcus looked at Tommy, who was visibly shaken by the evening's events, and made a decision that would change both their lives. He asked the geology student to become an unofficial consultant on the case, using his scientific skills to help analyze evidence that traditional police methods might miss. Tommy agreed, understanding that Jake Morrison deserved justice, even if it meant uncovering truths that some people prefer to keep buried. Daniel's reaction tells me that key is the most important piece of evidence we've found so far. The Cedar Falls Greyhound Station looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1970s, with faded blue paint peeling from the walls and fluorescent lights that buzzed ominously overhead. Marcus approached locker 247 with Tommy close behind, both men uncertain about what they might discover inside the cramped metal compartment. The key that Tommy had found near Jake's remains fit perfectly, turning with a soft click that seemed to echo through the nearly empty terminal. Inside the locker, wrapped in a deteriorating plastic bag, was a journal bound in cracked leather that appeared to have been handled frequently over the years. Marcus opened the journal carefully, noting that the pages were filled with Jake Morrison's distinctive handwriting. The entries dated back several months before his disappearance, revealing a troubled teenager who had stumbled upon information that would ultimately cost him his life. Jake had discovered that his father Robert and several other prominent Cedar Falls residents were involved in illegal activities that reached far beyond simple financial fraud. The journal detailed meetings, conversations, and transactions that painted a picture of systematic corruption involving the town's political and business leadership. The most disturbing entries described Jake's growing fear that his family was in danger because of what he had learned. He wrote about his father's increasing paranoia, mysterious phone calls at all hours, and strangers who seemed to be watching their house. Jake had begun documenting license plate numbers, taking photographs of suspicious individuals, and keeping detailed records of his father's activities. The teenager had realized that he was in possession of information that could destroy dozens of lives and possibly lead to criminal charges against people he had known since childhood. Tommy read over Marcus's shoulder, his scientific mind analyzing the evidence with clinical detachment. The journal entries were methodical and detailed, showing that Jake had approached his investigation with the same careful observation skills that Tommy used in his geological research. Jake had documented patterns of behavior, identified connections between seemingly unrelated events, and drawn conclusions that demonstrated remarkable insight for someone his age. The journal proved that Jake Morrison had been far more than an innocent victim. He had been an active investigator who had gotten too close to dangerous truths. One entry, dated just 3 days before Jake's disappearance, revealed the teenager's plan to expose the corruption he had discovered. He had arranged to meet with a journalist from the state capitol who specialized in investigating municipal fraud. Jake had copied important documents and planned to turn over evidence that would trigger a major investigation into Cedar Falls government and business community. The journal showed that Jake had been motivated by a desire to protect his family and his community, even though he understood the personal risks involved. Marcus realized that Jake's camping trip had been a cover story designed to get him away from Cedar Falls during the planned meeting with the journalist. But somehow, the people Jake was investigating had learned about his intentions and decided to stop him permanently. The detective began to understand why Daniel had reacted so strongly to the key discovery. He must have known about his brother's investigation and possibly even helped him hide evidence in the bus station locker. The journal's final entries described Jake's growing suspicion that someone close to him was reporting his activities to the people he was investigating. He wrote about feeling isolated and betrayed, unsure who he could trust with the dangerous information he had gathered. Jake had begun to suspect that even members of his own family might be involved in the corruption, or at least compromised by it. The teenager's final words revealed his determination to expose the truth, even if it cost him everything he held dear. Tommy discovered additional items in the locker that Jake had left behind: photographs of documents, copies of financial records, and a list of names that read like a who's who of Cedar Falls society. The evidence showed systematic embezzlement from municipal funds, illegal development deals, and what appeared to be money laundering operations involving several local businesses. Jake had assembled a comprehensive case that would have devastated the town's power structure and sent numerous people to prison. Among the names on Jake's list, Marcus recognized several individuals who had been involved in the original search efforts when the teenager disappeared. The irony was bitter. Some of the people who had pretended to help look for Jake were actually the ones responsible for his death. Marcus realized that the investigation had been compromised from the beginning, with key evidence possibly destroyed or misdirected by people who had insider access to the search operations. The detective's phone rang, interrupting his examination of Jake's evidence. The caller was his supervisor, Captain Reynolds, who informed him that Daniel Morrison had confessed to withholding information about his brother's investigation. Daniel had revealed that Jake had been receiving death threats in the weeks before his disappearance, and that their father Robert had been planning to relocate the family to another state for safety reasons. The camping trip had been intended as a final goodbye to their hometown before disappearing into witness protection. Marcus closed the journal and looked at Tommy, both men understanding the magnitude of what they had discovered. Jake Morrison hadn't been killed by a random predator or died in a hiking accident. He had been murdered by a conspiracy of respected citizens who were willing to kill a teenager to protect their illegal activities. The evidence in the locker proved that Jake's death was part of a larger pattern of corruption that had been hidden for over a decade. As they prepared to leave the bus station, Marcus knew that their investigation would soon put them in the same danger that had claimed Jake's life. This journal is going to turn Cedar Falls upside down, and there are people who will kill to keep it buried. Captain Reynolds' office felt smaller than usual as Marcus spread Jake's evidence across the conference table. The weight of 11 years of lies and cover-ups pressing down on everyone present. The captain studied the journal entries with growing alarm, his weathered face betraying the shock of someone who had lived in Cedar Falls' entire life and trusted its leaders implicitly. Reynolds had been a rookie officer when Jake disappeared, and he remembered the search efforts as a community coming together in tragedy. Now, he was learning that some of the most vocal volunteers had been the very people responsible for the teenager's death. Tommy sat quietly in the corner, his laptop open as he compiled digital copies of all the evidence they had discovered. His scientific background made him the perfect person to organize and analyze the complex web of financial records and personal connections that Jake had documented. Tommy had created a comprehensive database that linked names, dates, and transactions in ways that revealed the full scope of the corruption. The geology student had become an invaluable asset to the investigation, bringing analytical skills that complemented Marcus's detective instincts. The evidence revealed that Robert Morrison had been the town's building inspector, a position that gave him access to development plans and zoning decisions worth millions of dollars. Jake's journal showed that his father had been taking bribes to approve questionable construction projects and ignore safety violations that could have endangered public welfare. But Robert had apparently grown uncomfortable with the arrangement and was planning to expose the entire operation when Jake stumbled upon the truth independently. The teenager's investigation had accelerated everyone's timeline and forced the conspirators to take desperate action. Daniel Morrison sat in an interrogation room down the hall, finally ready to tell the complete truth about his brother's disappearance. He had confessed that Jake had approached him for help just days before the camping trip, explaining that he had evidence of crimes involving their father and asking Daniel to help him contact law enforcement. But Daniel had been torn between loyalty to his family and fear of the dangerous people Jake was investigating. His indecision had ultimately contributed to his brother's death, a guilt he had carried for 11 years. Marcus reviewed the list of names from Jake's investigation, recognizing several individuals who still held positions of power in Cedar Falls. Mayor William Hartley appeared frequently in the financial records, along with Police Chief Tom Brennan, who had overseen the original investigation into Jake's disappearance. The realization that the police chief might have been complicit in covering up the murder sent chills through Marcus, who understood that their current investigation was probably being monitored by the very people they were trying to expose. Captain Reynolds made the difficult decision to contact the state attorney general's office, recognizing that the Cedar Falls Police Department could not investigate its own leadership without compromising the case. He arranged for a special prosecutor to be assigned to the Morrison investigation, along with a team of state investigators who had no connections to the local community. Reynolds knew that this decision would effectively end his career in Cedar Falls, but he was determined to see justice served regardless of the personal cost. Tommy's analysis revealed a pattern of suspicious deaths and disappearances in Cedar Falls over the past 15 years, all involving people who might have posed threats to the corruption ring. A whistleblower at the water treatment plant had died in a suspicious car accident. A newspaper reporter investigating municipal contracts had moved away suddenly after receiving threats, and a former city councilman had suffered a convenient heart attack just before a crucial vote on development rights. Jake Morrison was just the most recent victim in a long line of people who had been silenced to protect the conspiracy. The breakthrough in understanding the full scope of the operation came when Tommy discovered a pattern in the burial site that he had initially overlooked. The soil analysis showed traces of chemicals typically used in construction projects, suggesting that Jake's body had been transported from a building site before being buried at Deadfall Ridge. Cross-referencing this information with Jake's journal revealed that Morrison Construction, owned by the mayor's brother-in-law, had been working on a project near the campsite during the week of Jake's disappearance. Marcus realized that Jake had probably been taken to the construction site immediately after his disappearance, possibly tortured for information about what evidence he had gathered and who else knew about his investigation. The teenager's murder had been carefully planned and executed by people with the resources and connections to cover their tracks effectively. The fact that Jake's body had been moved and buried days later showed the calculating nature of his killers, who had taken time to stage the scene and eliminate any traces of their involvement. As evening approached, Marcus received a disturbing phone call from an unknown number. The voice was electronically disguised, but the message was clear. The investigation into Jake Morrison's death needed to stop immediately, or other people would start disappearing just like the teenager had 11 years ago. The caller specifically mentioned Tommy by name, indicating that the geology student was now a target because of his involvement in discovering the buried evidence. Marcus realized that their investigation had moved beyond solving a cold case. They were now fighting for their lives against people who had already proven they were willing to kill to protect their secrets. Captain Reynolds arranged for protective details to watch both Marcus and Tommy, understanding that the conspiracy they were investigating still had the power and motivation to eliminate threats. The captain also moved quickly to secure all evidence in a location outside of Cedar Falls, recognizing that keeping it at the local police station would make it vulnerable to tampering or destruction. As the investigation team prepared for what they knew would be a dangerous confrontation with the town's power structure, Marcus couldn't help but think about Jake Morrison's courage in pursuing the truth despite knowing the risks involved. That kid was braver than most adults I know, and we're going to make sure his sacrifice wasn't in vain. The state investigators arrived in Cedar Falls at dawn, their unmarked vehicles creating an atmosphere of tension that spread through the small town like wildfire. Special Agent Sarah Kim led the team with the kind of professional competence that came from years of investigating municipal corruption cases. She immediately established a command center at the county courthouse, deliberately choosing a location outside the direct influence of the Cedar Falls Police Department. Marcus found himself both relieved and anxious as he briefed Agent Kim on the Morrison case, understanding that the investigation was now beyond his control, but hopeful that justice might finally be served. Tommy had spent the night at a safe house arranged by Captain Reynolds, his laptop and research materials under constant guard by state protection officers. The geology student had continued his analysis of the burial site evidence, discovering new details that painted an even more disturbing picture of Jake's final days. Chemical traces in the soil suggested that Jake had been held at multiple locations before being killed, possibly moved between different sites to avoid detection. Tommy's scientific approach was revealing details that traditional police work might have missed, making him an invaluable asset to the expanded investigation. Daniel Morrison's full confession provided the missing pieces of the timeline that had puzzled investigators for over a decade. He revealed that Jake had been planning to meet with the journalist on the day after their camping trip was supposed to end, using the family vacation as an alibi for his absence from town. But someone had learned about the planned meeting and decided to intercept Jake before he could share his evidence. Daniel admitted that he suspected their father Robert had been forced to participate in setting up Jake's capture, possibly under threats to the entire family's safety. Agent Kim's team began executing search warrants across Cedar Falls, targeting the homes and offices of everyone mentioned in Jake's journal. The searches revealed additional evidence of the corruption ring's activities, including financial records that had been hidden for years and communication devices used to coordinate illegal activities. Mayor Hartley was arrested at his home, along with Police Chief Brennan and several prominent business owners who had been identified in Jake's investigation. The arrests sent shockwaves through the community as residents struggled to understand how their trusted leaders could have been involved in such horrible crimes. Marcus accompanied Agent Kim to the Morrison construction offices, where they discovered evidence that confirmed Tommy's analysis of the burial site. Soil samples stored in the company's equipment yard matched the chemical traces found near Jake's remains, proving that the teenager's body had been at the construction site before being moved to Deadfall Ridge. The discovery also revealed that Morrison Construction had been used as a front for money laundering operations, with fake projects and inflated contracts used to hide illegal payments from the corruption ring's activities. The investigation took a dramatic turn when workers at the construction site discovered additional human remains buried beneath a concrete foundation that had been poured during the week of Jake's disappearance. The remains belonged to Robert Morrison, Jake's father, who had apparently been killed alongside his son when he tried to protect the teenager or back out of the conspiracy. The discovery explained why Robert had never been able to provide a complete account of Jake's disappearance. He had been murdered before he could reveal what he knew about his son's investigation. Tommy's expertise became crucial in analyzing the expanded crime scene, as his geological knowledge helped investigators understand the timeline of the construction project and how it had been used to hide evidence. The concrete foundation had been poured in sections over several days, allowing the killers to bury both bodies and then cover them with industrial materials that would prevent detection by search dogs or ground-penetrating radar. Tommy's analysis showed that the entire construction project had been designed as an elaborate cover-up operation rather than a legitimate building effort. Agent Kim's team discovered that the corruption ring had been operating for nearly 20 years, systematically stealing millions of dollars from municipal funds and development projects. Jake Morrison had uncovered only a fraction of their activities, but his investigation had threatened to expose the entire operation to federal scrutiny. The teenager's murder had been intended as a warning to other potential whistleblowers, demonstrating the lengths to which the conspirators would go to protect their criminal enterprise. The arrest of Police Chief Brennan revealed the full extent of the cover-up that had derailed the original investigation into Jake's disappearance. Brennan had deliberately misdirected search efforts, suppressed evidence, and intimidated witnesses who might have provided crucial information. He had also been responsible for the suspicious deaths and disappearances of other people who had threatened the corruption ring over the years. The police chief's confession implicated additional conspirators and revealed the sophisticated network of corruption that had controlled Cedar Falls for decades. As the investigation expanded, Marcus realized that Jake Morrison's courage in pursuing the truth had ultimately saved his community from continued exploitation by corrupt leaders. The teenager's carefully documented evidence was leading to the largest municipal corruption prosecution in the state's history, with dozens of arrests and millions of dollars in stolen funds being recovered. Jake's death had been a tragedy, but his investigation was ensuring that justice would finally be served for all the victims of the conspiracy. Agent Kim pulled Marcus aside as the day's arrests were completed, expressing her admiration for the detective's persistence in pursuing the cold case despite obvious institutional resistance. She offered Marcus a position with the State Investigation Unit, recognizing his skills and dedication to seeking justice regardless of political pressure. Marcus considered the offer carefully, understanding that his career in Cedar Falls was effectively over, but excited about the opportunity to help solve similar cases in other communities. Jake Morrison may be gone, but his investigation is going to clean up this town and make sure something like this never happens again. The Cedar Falls Community Center had been transformed into a makeshift courthouse as the corruption trial began, with media representatives and state officials occupying every available seat. Marcus sat in the witness section, preparing to testify about the evidence that had ultimately exposed the conspiracy behind Jake Morrison's murder. The teenager's journal lay open on the prosecutor's table, its pages marked with sticky notes and highlighted passages that would help convict the people responsible for over 2 decades of systematic corruption. Tommy Chun sat nearby, his laptop ready to present the geological evidence that had proven the timeline and location of Jake's murder. The first defendant to face trial was former Mayor William Hartley, whose financial records showed millions of dollars in illegal payments from development projects and municipal contracts. Hartley's defense attorney tried to argue that his client had been coerced into participating in the corruption ring, but Jake's journal contained detailed observations of the mayor's enthusiastic participation in planning illegal activities. The teenager had documented conversations where Hartley discussed expanding their operations and recruiting additional conspirators, proving that he had been a willing leader rather than a reluctant participant. Daniel Morrison took the stand as a key witness, his testimony revealing the family dynamics that had led to both Jake and Robert's murders. He described his father's growing fear in the months before the camping trip, as Robert realized that the corruption ring was becoming more violent and dangerous. Daniel admitted that he had failed to support his brother's investigation because he was afraid of the consequences, a decision that had haunted him for 11 years. His emotional testimony helped the jury understand the psychological pressure that the conspiracy had placed on entire families. Former police chief Tom Brennan's trial revealed the extent to which the corruption ring had infiltrated law enforcement and used official resources to protect their criminal activities. Brennan had systematically destroyed evidence, intimidated witnesses, and misdirected investigations that threatened to expose the conspiracy. His arrest records showed a pattern of harassing honest citizens who had tried to report suspicious activities, while protecting the ring's members from any serious legal consequences. Jake's journal documented several instances where Brennan had threatened Robert Morrison to ensure his continued cooperation. Tommy's scientific testimony proved crucial in establishing the timeline and method of Jake's murder, his geological analysis providing evidence that traditional police work could never have uncovered. He explained how soil stratification and chemical traces had revealed that Jake's body had been moved multiple times before being buried at Deadfall Ridge. Tommy's presentation included detailed charts and photographs that showed the deliberate nature of the burial, proving that Jake's death had been carefully planned rather than the result of a hiking accident or spontaneous violence. The prosecution revealed that Jake Morrison's investigation had been far more comprehensive than anyone had initially realized, with the teenager having identified corruption involving school districts, hospital administration, and even the local utility companies. His evidence showed that the conspiracy had affected virtually every aspect of life in Cedar Falls, with ordinary citizens paying inflated prices and receiving inferior services so that the ring's members could steal millions of dollars. Jake's dedication to documenting these crimes had made him a threat that the conspirators couldn't afford to ignore. Marcus testified about the discovery of Jake's watch and a subsequent investigation that had finally brought the truth to light. He described the moment when Tommy had found the key that led them to the bus station locker, and the shock of reading Jake's journal entries that revealed the scope of the corruption. Marcus emphasized that Jake Morrison had been a hero who had died trying to protect his community, and that the investigation had been successful only because of the teenager's careful documentation of the crimes he had uncovered. The trial revealed additional victims of the corruption ring's violence, including several people whose deaths had been classified as accidents or natural causes, but were actually murders designed to silence potential whistleblowers. A forensic accountant testified that the ring had stolen over $15 million from various municipal and county funds over 20 years, money that should have been used for schools, infrastructure, and public safety. The financial impact of their crimes had affected every resident of Cedar Falls, even those who had never known about the conspiracy. Agent Kim's testimony provided context for how municipal corruption cases typically develop and why they are so difficult to investigate when local law enforcement is compromised. She explained that the Morrison case had been unusually complex because of the ring's sophistication and their willingness to commit murder to protect their operations. Kim praised both Marcus and Tommy for their persistence in pursuing the truth despite obvious dangers, noting that their work had led to one of the most successful corruption prosecutions in state history. As the trials progressed, the full extent of the conspiracy's impact on Cedar Falls became clear to residents who had been unaware of the systematic theft and abuse of power that had controlled their community for decades. Public infrastructure projects had been deliberately delayed or canceled so that ring members could profit from emergency repairs. School funding had been diverted to fake consulting contracts, and environmental protections had been ignored to benefit connected developers. Jake Morrison's investigation had revealed crimes that had affected every aspect of community life. The defense attorneys attempted to portray their clients as victims of a system that had gradually corrupted them over time, but Jake's journal contained evidence of their enthusiastic participation in planning and executing criminal activities. The teenager had documented conversations where ring members discussed expanding their operations, recruiting new participants, and eliminating people who pose threats to their activities. His careful observations proved that the conspiracy had been led by people who were motivated by greed rather than coercion. As the first phase of trials concluded, Marcus reflected on the courage that Jake Morrison had shown in pursuing his investigation despite knowing the risks involved. The teenager had understood that exposing the corruption ring would probably cost him his life, but he had been determined to protect his community and his family from continued exploitation. Jake's sacrifice had ultimately saved Cedar Falls from decades of additional corruption and ensured that future generations would inherit a community governed by honest leaders rather than criminal conspirators. This kid's journal is going to be studied in law enforcement academies for years as an example of how one person's courage can bring down an entire criminal organization. The sentencing hearing for the corruption ring's leaders drew crowds that overflowed from the community center into the parking lot, where speakers have been set up so that everyone could hear the judge's decisions. Marcus watched from the front row as each defendant received lengthy prison terms that reflected both the severity of their crimes and the special horror of murdering a teenager who had been trying to protect his community. Mayor Hartley received life without parole for his role in orchestrating Jake's murder, while Police Chief Brennan got a similar sentence for his systematic cover-up of the crimes and his intimidation of potential witnesses over 2 decades. Tommy sat beside Marcus, his laptop containing the final report that would be submitted to the State Attorney General's office documenting every aspect of the corruption ring's activities. The geology student had become an expert witness whose scientific approach to analyzing evidence had revolutionized how investigators approached complex criminal cases. Universities across the country were already requesting copies of Tommy's methodology, recognizing that his geological techniques could be applied to other cold cases where traditional police work had failed to find crucial evidence. Daniel Morrison attended the sentencing hearing with his wife and young children, finally able to begin healing from the guilt and trauma that had defined his life since his brother's disappearance. His testimony during the trials had been crucial in helping the jury understand the psychological pressure that the corruption ring had placed on families throughout Cedar Falls. Daniel had established a scholarship fund in Jake's memory, designed to support young people who showed the same courage and integrity that his brother had demonstrated in pursuing dangerous truths. The financial restitution ordered by the court totaled over $20 million, money that would be returned to the municipal fund from which it had been stolen over 2 decades. The recovered funds would allow Cedar Falls to finally complete infrastructure projects that had been delayed or canceled because of the corruption ring's theft, including school renovations, road repairs, and environmental cleanup efforts that would benefit the entire community. Jake's investigation had not only brought his killers to justice, but it also ensured that his hometown would have the resources needed to rebuild and prosper. Agent Kim announced that the Morrison case had led to the creation of a new state task force dedicated to investigating municipal corruption, with Marcus selected as the lead detective and Tommy serving as the chief scientific consultant. The task force would use the techniques developed during the Morrison investigation to examine suspicious cases in other communities, potentially uncovering corruption rings that had operated undetected for years. Jake's journal had become a template for how citizens could document and expose systematic government corruption, even when local law enforcement was compromised. The community of Cedar Falls began the difficult process of rebuilding trust in their local government, with new elections scheduled and strict oversight procedures implemented to prevent future corruption. Residents who had been unaware of the systematic theft and abuse of power were shocked to learn how extensively their community had been exploited, but they were also inspired by Jake Morrison's example of courage in the face of overwhelming danger. Memorial gardens were planned for both Jake and his father Robert, recognizing their sacrifice in exposing the criminal conspiracy. Marcus received commendations from both state and federal law enforcement agencies for his persistence in pursuing the Morrison case despite institutional resistance and personal danger. His promotion to head the new anti-corruption task force represented a significant career advancement, but more importantly, it gave him the opportunity to ensure that other victims of government corruption would receive the justice that had been denied to them for years. The detective understood that Jake's investigation had started a movement that would continue long after the current trials were completed. Tommy's geological expertise had proven so valuable in solving the Morrison case that several other states requested his assistance in analyzing cold cases where traditional investigative methods had failed. The geology student was completing his graduate degree while working part-time with law enforcement agencies, developing new techniques for using soil analysis and environmental evidence to solve complex criminal cases. His work had shown that scientific methods could reveal crucial information that had been overlooked by conventional police investigations. The trials had revealed that the corruption ring's activities had extended beyond Cedar Falls into neighboring communities, leading to additional investigations and arrests throughout the region. Jake's journal had documented connections to criminal organizations in other counties, providing evidence that helped prosecutors build cases against dozens of additional defendants. The teenager's investigation had ultimately exposed a network of corruption that had affected hundreds of thousands of people across multiple jurisdictions. As the legal proceedings concluded, Marcus visited Jake Morrison's grave for the first time since the teenager's remains had been properly buried beside his father. The headstone bore an inscription that captured Jake's legacy. He died seeking truth and found justice for his community. Marcus placed a copy of the final investigation report on the grave, along with newspaper clippings documenting the convictions and reforms that had resulted from Jake's courage. The detective understood that while Jake's life had been cut tragically short, his investigation had saved countless others from continued exploitation and abuse. The Morrison case had fundamentally changed how law enforcement approached municipal corruption investigations, with Jake's documentation methods being taught in police academies and his story inspiring other citizens to report suspicious government activities. Tommy's scientific techniques were being adopted by forensic teams across the country, proving that geological evidence could provide crucial information in cases where traditional methods had failed. Together, Marcus and Tommy had ensured that Jake Morrison's sacrifice would continue to serve justice for years to come. Looking back on the investigation, Marcus realized that finding Jake's watch had been just the beginning of a journey that had ultimately transformed an entire community and revolutionized law enforcement techniques. The teenager's determination to document and expose corruption had created a legacy that would protect future generations from the kind of systematic abuse that had controlled Cedar Falls for decades. Jake Morrison proved that one person with courage and determination can change the world, even if they don't live to see the results of their sacrifice. 6 months after the trials concluded, Marcus found himself standing in the parking lot of Morrison Construction, watching as demolition crews prepare to tear down the building where Jake and Robert Morrison had been murdered. The construction company had been seized by the state as part of the criminal asset forfeiture process, and the building would be replaced with a memorial park dedicated to victims of government corruption. Tommy stood beside him, taking final soil samples from the site for his expanding database of forensic geological evidence that was being used to train investigators across the country. The demolition revealed additional evidence that had been hidden within the building's structure for over a decade, including personal belongings that had been taken from Jake during his captivity. Among the recovered items was Jake's backpack, containing his camera with undeveloped film that showed photographs he had taken while investigating the corruption ring. The images provided additional evidence of illegal activities and identified several conspirators who had not been mentioned in Jake's journal, leading to a new round of arrests and prosecutions. Marcus had been working with the Anti-Corruption Task Force for several months, traveling to communities across the state where citizens had reported suspicious government activities. The Morrison case had inspired other whistleblowers to come forward with evidence of municipal corruption, leading to investigations in dozens of towns and cities. Marcus found that each case had similarities to what had happened in Cedar Falls: systematic theft of public funds, intimidation of honest citizens, and the use of violence to silence potential witnesses. Tommy's reputation as a forensic geologist had grown to national prominence, with law enforcement agencies requesting his assistance on cold cases throughout the region. He had developed new techniques for analyzing burial sites and had discovered that many suspicious deaths classified as accidents or natural causes were actually murders designed to protect criminal conspiracies. Tommy's scientific approach had revolutionized how investigators examined crime scenes, proving that geological evidence could provide crucial information years or even decades after crimes were committed. The success of the Morrison investigation had attracted attention from federal agencies interested in combating municipal corruption on a larger scale. Agent Kim had been promoted to head a new FBI task force focused on government corruption, and she had recruited both Marcus and Tommy to serve as consultants on cases involving complex criminal conspiracies. Their work was expanding beyond individual communities to examine regional networks of corruption that affected multiple jurisdictions simultaneously. Daniel Morrison had become an unexpected advocate for government transparency, speaking at conferences and community meetings about the warning signs of municipal corruption. His personal experience with the devastating effects of government criminality had made him an effective spokesperson for reform movements across the state. Daniel had also worked with legislators to pass new laws requiring greater oversight of municipal contracts and stricter penalties for public officials who abuse their positions of trust. The Memorial Park plan for the Morrison construction site would include an educational center where Jake's journal and investigation materials would be displayed for public viewing. The center would serve as a training facility for citizens who wanted to learn how to identify and document government corruption in their own communities. Marcus had worked with Tommy to develop educational materials that would teach ordinary citizens how to use Jake's investigative techniques to protect themselves from corrupt officials. The investigation had revealed that Jake Morrison's murder was part of a pattern of violence that had been used to control Cedar Falls for over 20 years, with numerous suspicious deaths and disappearances connected to the corruption ring's activities. Forensic teams were exhuming bodies and re-examining old cases, using Tommy's geological techniques to determine which deaths had been murders rather than accidents. The expanded investigation was providing closure for families who had suspected their loved ones had been victims of foul play. Marcus received a call from Agent Kim informing him that the Morrison case had been selected as the subject of a federal study on municipal corruption, with recommendations for how other communities could protect themselves from similar criminal conspiracies. The study would examine how Jake's investigation techniques could be adapted for use by citizens' watchdog groups and how law enforcement agencies could better detect and respond to systematic government corruption. Jake's legacy was expanding from local impact to national influence. The financial recovery from the corruption ring's activities had exceeded initial estimates, with investigators discovering hidden assets and offshore accounts that brought the total restitution to over $30 million. The recovered funds were being used not only to repair the damage caused by decades of theft, but also to implement new oversight systems that would prevent future corruption. Cedar Falls was becoming a model for how communities could rebuild after being victimized by systematic government criminality. Tommy's research had attracted the attention of academic institutions interested in developing new forensic techniques for analyzing complex crime scenes. Several universities had offered him positions that would allow him to continue his law enforcement work while training the next generation of forensic scientists. Tommy was considering offers that would let him establish a research center dedicated to applying geological science to criminal investigations, using Jake's case as the foundation for developing new investigative methodologies. The success of the Morrison investigation had also inspired other cold case detectives to re-examine suspicious disappearances and deaths that might be connected to government corruption. Marcus was consulted on several cases where teenagers or young adults had disappeared after discovering evidence of illegal activities by public officials. The pattern was disturbingly common. Young people with strong moral convictions who had stumbled upon criminal conspiracies and paid for their integrity with their lives. As Marcus reflected on the investigation's impact, he realized that Jake Morrison's courage had created a ripple effect that was transforming how law enforcement approached government corruption cases across the country. The teenager's determination to document and expose criminal activities had provided a template for future investigations and had inspired countless others to stand up against corruption in their own communities. Jake's death had been a tragedy, but his investigation had saved thousands of other potential victims from similar fates. The demolition of Morrison Construction was scheduled to begin at sunset, symbolically ending one chapter of Cedar Falls history while beginning another focused on transparency and accountability. Marcus and Tommy would witness the destruction of the building where Jake had been murdered, understanding that its replacement with a memorial park would ensure that the teenager's sacrifice would never be forgotten. Jake's investigation started in this building, but its impact is going to reach communities all across the country. The grand opening of the Jake Morrison Memorial Park drew visitors from across the state, including law enforcement officials, government reform advocates, and families of corruption victims who had found hope in Jake's story. Marcus stood near the memorial statue, depicting a young man holding a journal, watching as children played on equipment purchased with funds recovered from the corruption ring's criminal activities. The park had become a symbol of how communities could rebuild and thrive after exposing systematic government criminality, transforming a site of tragedy into a place of hope and education. Tommy had established the Morrison Institute for Forensic Geology in a building adjacent to the memorial park, where he trained law enforcement officers in the techniques he had developed while investigating Jake's murder. The institute had become a center for innovative crime scene analysis, with investigators from around the world traveling to Cedar Falls to learn Tommy's methods for using geological evidence to solve complex cases. The institute's success had brought national recognition to the small town, attracting researchers and students who contributed to the local economy. Marcus received regular updates on cases across the country where Jake's investigative techniques were being used to expose government corruption and solve cold cases. A teenager in Oregon had used Jake's documentation methods to expose illegal logging contracts that were destroying protected forests, while a college student in Florida had uncovered systematic voter fraud using techniques inspired by Jake's journal. The ripple effects of Jake's investigation continued to expand, with each new case adding to his legacy of courage and integrity. The federal study based on the Morrison case had been completed and distributed to law enforcement agencies nationwide, providing a comprehensive guide for investigating municipal corruption and protecting whistleblowers. The study included detailed analysis of Jake's investigation methods, Tommy's geological techniques, and Marcus's detective work, creating a template that could be adapted for use in different communities and jurisdictions. Federal funding was being provided to implement the study's recommendations in communities at high risk for government corruption. Daniel Morrison had written a book about his brother's investigation and its aftermath, with proceeds supporting scholarship funds for students who showed Jake's commitment to truth and justice. The book had become a bestseller, inspiring readers across the country to become more engaged in monitoring their local governments and demanding accountability from elected officials. Daniel's speaking tours had taken him to dozens of communities where citizens were organizing to prevent the kind of corruption that had controlled Cedar Falls for decades. Agent Kim's federal task force had expanded into a permanent division within the FBI, focused specifically on investigating systematic government corruption and protecting citizens who reported illegal activities by public officials. The division used techniques developed during the Morrison investigation to examine suspicious patterns of deaths and disappearances that might be connected to criminal conspiracies. Kim's team had already uncovered corruption rings in several other states, using Jake's documentation methods and Tommy's geological analysis to build successful prosecutions. The educational center at the Memorial Park had become a popular destination for school field trips and civic groups interested in learning about government accountability and citizen participation. Interactive displays showed how Jake had conducted his investigation, while hands-on exhibits taught visitors how to identify warning signs of corruption and document suspicious activities. The center had processed thousands of visitors in its first year, spreading awareness about government corruption and inspiring citizens to become more active in monitoring their local officials. Marcus had been invited to testify before Congress about the need for stronger federal oversight of municipal governments and better protection for whistleblowers who expose corruption. His testimony described how Jake Morrison's investigation had revealed systematic failures in oversight systems that allowed criminal conspiracies to operate undetected for decades. Marcus advocated for legislation that would provide federal resources to help communities investigate suspicious government activities and protect citizens who reported illegal conduct. Tommy's geological techniques had been adopted by forensic teams in over 30 states, leading to the solution of numerous cold cases that had been unsolvable using traditional investigative methods. His research had proven that environmental evidence could provide crucial information about crimes committed years or decades earlier, revolutionizing how law enforcement approach historical cases. Tommy's work had also led to the development of new technologies for analyzing soil samples and other geological evidence, making forensic geology a standard part of criminal investigations. The success of the Anti-Corruption Task Force had led to its expansion into a permanent state agency dedicated to investigating government corruption and supporting local law enforcement agencies that might be compromised by criminal conspiracies. Marcus had been promoted to director of the agency, overseeing investigations in communities across the state and providing resources to citizens who suspected their local governments of illegal activities. The agency had already initiated investigations in dozens of communities, using Jake's techniques to identify and prosecute corrupt officials. The memorial park had become a pilgrimage site for families of government corruption victims, who found comfort in Jake's story and inspiration in his courage to pursue dangerous truths. A memorial wall displayed the names of other victims who had died trying to expose government corruption, creating a permanent record of the human cost of systematic criminality. The wall served as a reminder that Jake's sacrifice was part of a larger struggle for government accountability that required ongoing vigilance from engaged citizens. As Marcus reflected on the transformation that had occurred since Tommy first discovered Jake's watch, he marveled at how one teenager's determination to seek truth had created a national movement for government reform. Jake's investigation had not only brought his killers to justice, but had also inspired thousands of other citizens to become active in monitoring their local governments and demanding accountability from elected officials. The teenager's legacy continued to grow with each new case solved using his techniques and each new corruption ring exposed using his methods. The anniversary of Jake's disappearance had become a national day of recognition for government accountability advocates, with communities across the country organizing events to honor victims of corruption and recommit to the principles of transparency and integrity that Jake had died defending. Marcus knew that while Jake's life had been tragically short, his impact on American democracy would continue for generations, inspiring future citizens to have the courage to stand up against corruption and demand better from their elected officials. Jake Morrison proved that one person with courage and a commitment to truth can change the world, and his legacy is going to keep changing it for decades to come. 3 years after the Morrison trials concluded, Marcus received an urgent phone call from Agent Kim reporting that new evidence had surfaced suggesting the corruption ring's activities had extended far beyond Cedar Falls into a multi-state criminal network. A former accountant for one of the convicted conspirators had come forward with financial records showing connections to similar corruption rings in neighboring states, revealing that Jake Morrison had uncovered only a small portion of a massive criminal enterprise. The accountant, fearing for his safety, had kept the evidence hidden until he learned about the success of the Morrison investigation and the protection offered to whistleblowers. Tommy was called in to analyze new burial sites that had been discovered in 3 different states, where the geological signatures matched those found at the Morrison construction site. Using techniques he had perfected during Jake's case, Tommy determined that the burial methods were identical, suggesting that the same group of killers had been operating across multiple jurisdictions for decades. The discovery meant that Jake's murder was part of a pattern of violence that had claimed dozens of victims who had threatened to expose systematic government corruption throughout the region. The expanded investigation revealed that Jake's journal had documented meetings between Cedar Falls conspirators and representatives from corruption rings in other communities, showing that the teenager had unknowingly stumbled upon a coordinated criminal network that controlled municipal governments across several states. Jake's careful observations had captured evidence of a sophisticated operation that used identical methods to steal public funds, intimidate honest citizens, and eliminate threats through violence. His investigation had been even more dangerous and significant than anyone had initially realized. Marcus found himself leading a multi-state task force that included investigators from federal agencies and law enforcement departments that had been vetted for corruption. The task force used Jake's documentation methods and Tommy's geological techniques to examine suspicious cases across the region, discovering that many deaths previously classified as accidents or natural causes were actually murders committed to protect the criminal network. The scope of the investigation had grown to include over 100 potential victims and dozens of communities that had been systematically exploited for decades. Daniel Morrison's advocacy work had attracted the attention of criminal network members who were still at large, leading to death threats that required him to enter witness protection with his family. The threats confirmed that Jake's investigation continued to pose dangers to surviving members of the conspiracy, even years after the original trials had concluded. Daniel's experience demonstrated that fighting government corruption required long-term commitment and ongoing protection for those brave enough to speak truth to power. The Memorial Park in Cedar Falls had become the headquarters for a national organization dedicated to fighting government corruption, with Jake's story serving as inspiration for citizens' watchdog groups across the country. The organization provided training and resources for people who wanted to monitor their local governments and report suspicious activities, using techniques developed from Jake's investigation to help ordinary citizens become effective anti-corruption advocates. The park hosted annual conferences that brought together corruption fighters from around the world. Tommy's Institute had expanded into a major research center that analyzed evidence from corruption cases throughout North America, with satellite facilities in several other states providing forensic geology services to law enforcement agencies. The Institute's success had transformed Cedar Falls into an unlikely center for criminal justice innovation, attracting researchers, students, and investigators who contributed to the local economy while advancing the science of corruption investigation. Tommy's techniques were being taught in universities worldwide, spreading Jake's legacy to international law enforcement communities. The federal legislation inspired by Jake's case had been passed by Congress, providing resources for investigating government corruption and protecting whistleblowers who exposed illegal activities by public officials. The legislation included funding for training programs based on Jake's investigation methods and Tommy's geological techniques, ensuring that law enforcement agencies across the country had access to the tools needed to combat systematic corruption. The law was officially named the Morrison Act, permanently enshrining Jake's contribution to government accountability. Marcus discovered that Jake's investigation had influenced corruption cases in other countries, where his documentation methods were being used to expose government criminality and protect democratic institutions. International law enforcement agencies had requested copies of Jake's journal and Tommy's geological analysis, adapting their techniques for use in different legal and cultural contexts. Jake's legacy had expanded from local impact to global influence, inspiring anti-corruption efforts on multiple continents. The expanded investigation revealed that the criminal network had been responsible for stealing hundreds of millions of dollars from public funds across multiple states, money that should have been used for schools, infrastructure, and public safety. The financial impact of their crimes had affected millions of citizens who had received inferior services and paid inflated taxes to support the conspirators' illegal activities. Jake's investigation had ultimately protected taxpayers throughout the region from continued exploitation and abuse. Agent Kim's federal division had grown into a major law enforcement agency with offices in every state, dedicated to investigating government corruption and supporting local authorities who might be compromised by criminal conspiracies. The division used techniques pioneered during the Morrison investigation to examine suspicious patterns of deaths, disappearances, and government contract awards that might indicate systematic corruption. Kim's agency had become a model for how federal resources could support local anti-corruption efforts, without undermining legitimate government functions. The success of the multi-state investigation had attracted international attention from countries struggling with their own government corruption problems, leading to requests for technical assistance and training programs based on the Morrison case. Marcus and Tommy had traveled to several countries to train investigators in their techniques, spreading Jake's legacy to law enforcement communities around the world. The teenagers' investigation had become a case study in international law enforcement academies, inspiring anti-corruption efforts globally. As Marcus reflected on the continuing expansion of Jake's impact, he realized that the teenagers' courage had created a movement that was transforming how societies approached the problem of government corruption. Jake's determination to document and expose criminal activities had provided tools and inspiration for countless others who were fighting similar battles in their own communities. The investigation that had started with a ticking watch buried in mountain dirt had grown into a global force for government accountability and democratic reform. Jake Morrison's investigation keeps growing and reaching new people who need the courage to fight corruption in their own communities. 5 years after Jake Morrison's watch had been discovered still ticking in the mountain dirt, Marcus stood before an international conference of anti-corruption investigators, describing how one teenager's courage had revolutionized the fight against government criminality worldwide. Representatives from 43 countries had gathered to learn about the Morrison techniques, with many reporting successful prosecutions in their own jurisdictions using methods developed during Jake's investigation. The conference was being held at the Jake Morrison International Center for Government Accountability, built on the site where the original corruption ring had held their secret meetings. Tommy's geological analysis methods have been adopted by forensic teams on 6 continents, leading to the solution of hundreds of cold cases involving government corruption and systematic violence against whistleblowers. His techniques had proven that environmental evidence could reveal crucial information about crimes committed decades earlier, revolutionizing how investigators approached historical cases involving political murders and disappeared activists. Tommy's research had also led to the development of portable geological analysis equipment that could be used in remote locations where traditional forensic resources were unavailable. The multi-state criminal network that Jake had unknowingly exposed had been completely dismantled, with over 200 conspirators convicted and sentenced to lengthy prison terms. The investigation had recovered nearly $500 million in stolen public funds, money that was being returned to communities that had been systematically exploited for decades. The financial recovery had allowed dozens of towns and cities to complete infrastructure projects that had been delayed or canceled because of the conspiracy's theft, improving services for millions of citizens. Daniel Morrison had become a prominent international advocate for government transparency, working with reform organizations in countries where corruption threatened democratic institutions and human rights. His book about Jake's investigation had been translated into 27 languages, inspiring anti-corruption movements around the world and providing practical guidance for citizens who wanted to monitor their governments and report illegal activities. Daniel's speaking tours had taken him to countries emerging from authoritarian rule, where Jake's story provided hope and practical tools for building accountable governance. The Morrison Act had been updated and expanded several times, with new provisions providing enhanced protection for whistleblowers and additional resources for investigating complex corruption cases. The legislation had served as a model for similar laws in other countries, creating an international framework for combating government corruption and protecting citizens who exposed illegal activities by public officials. The law's success had demonstrated that effective anti-corruption legislation could be developed based on real-world case studies rather than theoretical approaches. Marcus had been appointed as the first director of the United Nations Office for Anti-Corruption Investigation, a new agency created to provide technical assistance and training to countries struggling with systematic government corruption. The office used techniques developed during the Morrison investigation to help national governments investigate their own corruption problems and build institutional capacity for preventing future criminal conspiracies. Marcus's appointment recognized the international significance of Jake's investigation and its continuing impact on global anti-corruption efforts. The Memorial Park in Cedar Falls had been designated as an international heritage site, recognizing its importance as the birthplace of modern anti-corruption investigation techniques. The park received visitors from around the world, including government officials, law enforcement officers, and citizens groups who came to learn about Jake's investigation and its methods. The educational center had been expanded to include interactive exhibits demonstrating corruption investigation techniques and providing resources for visitors who wanted to implement similar programs in their own communities. Tommy's Institute had established partnerships with universities and law enforcement agencies on every continent, creating a global network for sharing information about corruption cases and developing new investigative techniques. The Institute's research had led to breakthrough discoveries about how criminal conspiracies operate across international borders, providing law enforcement agencies with tools for investigating complex cases involving multiple jurisdictions. Tommy's work had also contributed to the development of international protocols for sharing evidence and coordinating investigations across national boundaries. The success of the Morrison investigation had inspired the creation of similar cold case review programs in dozens of countries, where suspicious deaths and disappearances of anti-corruption activists were being re-examined using modern forensic techniques. These programs had led to hundreds of new prosecutions and had provided closure for families who had suspected their loved ones were victims of political violence. The global impact of Jake's investigation had created a movement for historical justice that was helping societies confront their past experiences with government corruption and violence. Agent Kim's federal division had become a model for other countries seeking to establish specialized anti-corruption law enforcement agencies that could operate independently of potentially compromised local authorities. The division's success had demonstrated that federal resources could effectively support local anti-corruption efforts while respecting legitimate government functions and democratic principles. Kim's agency had provided training and technical assistance to similar organizations in over 30 countries, spreading American expertise in corruption investigation worldwide. The annual Jake Morrison Day had become an international observance, with events held in cities around the world to honor corruption victims and recommit to the principles of government accountability and transparency. The day featured educational programs, memorial services, and training workshops that helped citizens learn how to monitor their governments and report suspicious activities. The global observance had created an international community of anti-corruption advocates who shared resources and supported each other's efforts to fight government criminality. As Marcus prepared to address the international conference, he reflected on the remarkable journey that had begun with Tommy's discovery of a ticking watch in the mountain dirt. Jake Morrison's courage in pursuing dangerous truths had created a global movement that was transforming how societies approached government accountability and democratic governance. The teenager's investigation had not only brought his killers to justice, but had also provided tools and inspiration for countless others fighting similar battles around the world. Jake's legacy continued to grow with each new case solved using his techniques, each new corruption ring exposed using his methods, and each new generation of citizens inspired by his example of courage in the face of overwhelming danger. Jake Morrison proved that one person with courage can change the world, and his investigation continues to change it every single day. 10 years had passed since Tommy Chon first discovered Jake Morrison's watch ticking in the mountain dirt, and the world had been transformed by the investigation that followed. Marcus stood in his office at the United Nations headquarters in New York, reviewing reports from anti-corruption operations in 78 countries that were using techniques developed from Jake's case. The teenager's journal had been digitized and translated into over 50 languages, becoming the most widely used resource for citizens seeking to expose government corruption and protect democratic institutions from criminal infiltration. The Jake Morrison Global Anti-Corruption Network had grown into the world's largest organization dedicated to fighting government criminality, with over 2 million members across 6 continents sharing information and supporting each other's investigations. The network used encrypted communication systems to protect whistleblowers and activists who faced threats similar to those that had cost Jake his life. Member organizations had successfully exposed corruption in hundreds of communities, leading to thousands of prosecutions and the recovery of billions of dollars in stolen public funds. Tommy's geological investigation techniques had revolutionized forensic science, with his methods now taught in universities worldwide and used by law enforcement agencies in virtually every developed country. The Tommy Chun Institute for Forensic Geology had expanded into a multinational research organization with facilities on every continent, providing scientific analysis for corruption cases and training the next generation of forensic investigators. Tommy's techniques had solved over 3,000 cold cases involving government corruption, political murders, and systematic violence against activists and whistleblowers. Daniel Morrison had established the Morrison Foundation, a charitable organization that provided legal support, protection services, and financial assistance to corruption whistleblowers and their families. The foundation operated safe houses in dozens of countries, offering refuge to people whose lives were threatened because of their efforts to expose government criminality. Daniel's work had saved hundreds of lives and enabled countless investigations that might otherwise have been abandoned due to safety concerns or lack of resources. The success of international anti-corruption efforts had led to significant changes in how governments operated, with many countries implementing transparency requirements and oversight systems inspired by lessons learned from Jake's investigation. The Morrison Protocols, a set of international standards for government accountability, have been adopted by over 100 nations seeking to prevent the kind of systematic corruption that had controlled Cedar Falls for decades. These protocols required regular auditing of government finances, protection for whistleblowers, and citizen participation in monitoring government activities. Marcus had been invited to speak at the 10th anniversary memorial service at Jake Morrison Memorial Park, returning to Cedar Falls for the first time in several years. The small town had been transformed into an international center for anti-corruption research and training, with visitors from around the world coming to learn about Jake's investigation and its impact on global democracy. The memorial park had been expanded to include monuments honoring corruption victims from every continent, creating a sacred space dedicated to those who had died fighting for government accountability. The anniversary service drew thousands of attendees, including government officials, law enforcement officers, activists, and ordinary citizens whose lives had been touched by Jake's story. Tommy delivered the keynote address, describing how his accidental discovery of a teenager's buried watch had led to a global movement that was still growing and evolving. He emphasized that Jake's greatest legacy was not the specific techniques he had developed, but the courage he had shown in pursuing dangerous truths despite knowing the personal risks involved. Agent Kim, now retired from federal service, spoke about the institutional changes that had resulted from Jake's investigation, including new laws, enforcement agencies, and international cooperation agreements that were protecting democratic institutions worldwide. She described how Jake's case had demonstrated the importance of persistence in fighting corruption, even when the odds seemed overwhelming and the opposition appeared insurmountable. Kim emphasized that Jake's investigation had proven that ordinary citizens could successfully challenge powerful criminal conspiracies if they had the courage to document evidence and seek help from honest authorities. The memorial service included the unveiling of a new monument featuring Jake's most famous journal entry. Sometimes doing the right thing costs everything, but not doing it costs even more. The inscription had become a rallying cry for anti-corruption movements worldwide, inspiring activists who faced similar dangers in their own fights against government criminality. The monument was made from stone quarried from Deadfall Ridge, where Jake's body had been discovered, symbolically transforming the site of tragedy into a source of inspiration and hope. During the ceremony, Marcus announced the establishment of the Jake Morrison Fellowship Program, which would provide funding and training for young investigators interested in pursuing careers in anti-corruption work. The fellowship program was designed to ensure that Jake's legacy would continue through future generations of investigators who shared his commitment to truth and justice. The first class of fellows included young people from 37 countries, representing the global reach of Jake's influence and the continuing need for anti-corruption advocates worldwide. The anniversary celebration also featured the release of new research showing that communities using Morrison investigation techniques had experienced significant improvements in government efficiency, public satisfaction, and economic development. The research demonstrated that Jake's investigation had not only exposed criminal activity, but had also provided tools for building stronger, more accountable democratic institutions. Countries that had implemented Morrison protocols showed measurable improvements in governance indicators, proving that anti-corruption efforts could produce lasting positive change. As the memorial service concluded, Marcus reflected on the remarkable transformation that had occurred since a geology student had found a teenager's watch still ticking after 11 years buried in mountain dirt. Jake Morrison's courage in documenting and exposing government corruption had created a global movement that was protecting democratic institutions and improving lives worldwide. The teenager's investigation had proven that individual courage could triumph over systematic criminality, inspiring millions of people to stand up against corruption in their own communities. The legacy of Jake's investigation continued to expand with each new case solved using his techniques, each new corruption ring exposed using his methods, and each new generation of activists inspired by his example. Marcus knew that while Jake's life had been tragically short, his impact on human civilization would continue for centuries, providing tools and inspiration for future generations fighting to preserve democracy and government accountability. The watch that had kept ticking in the darkness had ultimately illuminated corruption around the world, proving that truth and justice could prevail even against the most powerful criminal conspiracies. Jake Morrison's watch stopped ticking years ago, but his investigation will keep ticking forever, inspiring new generations to fight corruption and defend democracy. 15 years after Jake Morrison's disappearance, Marcus stood at the podium of the International Criminal Court in The Hague, delivering his final address as Director of Global Anti-Corruption Operations before retiring to write his memoirs about the case that had defined his career. The courtroom was filled with representatives from the Jake Morrison Global Network, now operating in 147 countries and credited with exposing corruption worth over $50 billion worldwide. The teenager's investigation techniques had become the gold standard for citizen-led anti-corruption efforts, with his journal serving as the foundational text for a new generation of democracy advocates. The Morrison case had fundamentally altered how the international community approached government corruption, leading to the establishment of the Global Transparency Treaty that required signatory nations to implement standardized anti-corruption measures and provide protection for whistleblowers. Over 90% of the world's countries had signed the treaty, recognizing that systematic corruption posed a threat to global stability and human rights that required coordinated international response. The treaty's enforcement mechanisms were based directly on lessons learned from Jake's investigation and its aftermath. Tommy Chun had been awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for his contributions to international justice through forensic geology, with the committee specifically citing his work in solving corruption-related murders and disappearances worldwide. His techniques had led to the prosecution of over 10,000 government officials and the resolution of nearly 5,000 cold cases involving political violence. Tommy's acceptance speech at the Nobel ceremony had focused on Jake Morrison's courage, emphasizing that all of his scientific achievements had been built on the foundation of one teenager's determination to seek truth regardless of personal cost. Daniel Morrison had become the Director General of the World Anti-Corruption Organization, a United Nations agency established to coordinate global efforts against government criminality and provide support for corruption victims and their families. Under Daniel's leadership, the organization had established networks of safe houses, legal aid clinics, and witness protection programs that had saved thousands of lives and enabled countless investigations that otherwise would have been impossible. Daniel's work had transformed his brother's individual sacrifice into a global infrastructure for protecting democracy and human rights. The town of Cedar Falls had been completely transformed by its association with the Morrison case, evolving from a small rural community into an international center for governance research and anti-corruption training. The Jake Morrison University, built on the site of the former corruption ring's headquarters, had become one of the world's leading institutions for studying democratic governance and training government accountability advocates. Students from every continent came to Cedar Falls to learn about corruption investigation techniques and democratic institution building. The Memorial Park had grown into a sprawling complex that included museums, research facilities, and training centers used by anti-corruption organizations worldwide. The park received over 1 million visitors annually, making it one of the most visited memorial sites in North America. The centerpiece of the expanded memorial was Jake's reconstructed bedroom, preserved exactly as it had been on the night before his final camping trip, serving as a reminder that extraordinary courage could emerge from the most ordinary circumstances. Marcus's memoirs, titled The Watch That Changed the World, had become an international bestseller and required reading in law enforcement academies and government transparency programs worldwide. The book detailed not only the investigation that had brought Jake's killers to justice, but also the global movement that had grown from the teenager's courage and sacrifice. Marcus had donated all proceeds from the book to the Morrison Foundation, ensuring that Jake's legacy would continue to protect future generations of anti-corruption advocates. The impact of Jake's investigation had extended far beyond law enforcement and government reform, inspiring changes in education, journalism, and civic engagement that were strengthening democratic institutions worldwide. Schools in dozens of countries had implemented Morrison citizenship programs that taught students how to monitor their local governments and report suspicious activities. News organizations had established Morrison units dedicated to investigating government corruption and protecting sources who exposed illegal activities by public officials. Agent Kim's Federal Anti-Corruption Division had evolved into a permanent cabinet-level department with offices in every state and territories overseas, demonstrating the American government's commitment to fighting corruption both domestically and internationally. The department had trained over 50,000 investigators worldwide and had provided technical assistance for corruption prosecutions in every region of the globe. Kim's retirement ceremony had been attended by law enforcement officials from 73 countries, recognizing her role in transforming Jake's local investigation into a global movement. The annual Jake Morrison Day had become one of the world's most widely observed international holidays, with events held in over 2,000 cities worldwide to honor corruption victims and renew commitments to government accountability. The day featured educational programs, memorial services, and citizen action workshops that helped ordinary people learn how to protect their communities from government criminality. The global observance had created an international community of millions of people united by Jake's example of courage in the face of overwhelming danger. As Marcus concluded his final official speech, he reflected on the extraordinary journey that had begun with a geology student's discovery of a ticking watch in mountain dirt. Jake Morrison's investigation had not only solved his own murder, but had created a global movement that was protecting democratic institutions and improving governance worldwide. The teenager's courage had proven that individual actions could have unlimited impact, inspiring positive change that would continue for generations yet unborn. The case had taught Marcus that real justice extended far beyond solving individual crimes to creating systems that prevented future victims and protected vulnerable people from those who would abuse power for personal gain. Jake's investigation had demonstrated that the fight against corruption required not just law enforcement action, but also citizen engagement, international cooperation, and institutional reform that addressed the root causes of government criminality. The teenager's legacy lived on in every community that had implemented transparency measures, every citizen who had found the courage to report suspicious activities, and every young person who had been inspired to pursue careers in public service and government accountability. As Marcus packed up his office for the final time, he placed a photograph of Jake Morrison's memorial statue on top of the box containing his case files, understanding that while his career was ending, Jake's investigation would continue forever. The watch that had been discovered still ticking after 11 years of burial had become a symbol of persistence, courage, and the triumph of truth over corruption. Jake Morrison had proven that one person with determination and integrity could change the world, and his investigation would keep changing it for centuries to come, inspiring future generations to defend democracy and fight for justice regardless of the personal cost. Jake Morrison's investigation will outlive all of us because truth and courage are immortal, and his example will inspire people to fight corruption as long as democracy exists. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It explores themes of mystery, horror, and the haunting weight of unsolved disappearances. Its purpose is to provoke suspense, raise awareness about the dangers of the wilderness, and inspire reflection on justice for those who go missing without answers.